Law Enforcement Encounters. Welcome back to Law Enforcement Encounters. I'm Samuel Davis Jr. Over 28 years with the Sacramento Police Department, I learned that some calls stay with you because they're dangerous. Others stay with you because they're heartbreaking. And then there are those calls that stay with you because they simply don't make sense. This is one of those stories. Episode: The Fried Chicken Surprise. I was working the graveyard shift in South Sacramento. At this point in my career, I had been on the street about 10 years. I had seen a lot by then. I had learned to trust my instincts. But I had also learned something just as important. You don't jump into conclusions. We were dispatched to a house because a man had reportedly passed out. By the time I arrived, the Sacramento Fire Department was already inside. As I walked through the front door, I saw two firefighters on the floor performing CPR on a man who looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s. Family members filled the living room. Some stood quietly, others peeked around the corner, watching what the firefighters were doing. Everyone seemed tense. Everyone except for one person, his wife. But before I even saw her, I noticed something else. The house smelled incredible. It smelled like somebody had just walked out of Kentucky Fried Chicken. That immediately caught my attention because that's not a smell you normally associate with a medical emergency. Then I looked toward the kitchen. There she was, standing over the stove, cooking chicken. What is going on with this scenario right here? So understand, this is her husband. He's out on the ground. Meanwhile, only a few feet away, firefighters were doing chest compressions on her husband. I remember thinking to myself, what am I looking at right now? The whole atmosphere felt different. It wasn't just that she was cooking, it was the feeling inside that house. You could almost feel the tension before anyone ever spoke. People whispered to one another. Kids answered questions carefully. Nobody seemed relaxed. Something had happened before we arrived. I didn't know what it was yet, but I knew there was more to this story. I asked one of the firefighters, how's he doing? And I was making reference to how is the father, the father and the husband, how's he doing? Any signs of positivity? He looked at me, looked back at the patient, and simply kind of shook his head like, I don't know. It's really, really difficult to say. So check out the thought process in my mind. I knock on the door because somebody's hurt. We don't know how they're hurt, but we just know that they're doing CPR on the person. And everybody in the house is acting weird. When I say weird, it is one of those weirds where nobody's going to say anything. And we get it. I understand it. I'm not trying to make anybody speak. I'm just trying to do my sections of these jobs, whatever my tasks throughout this whole situation. So he didn't have to say a word after that. I knew things weren't looking good. A short time later, they loaded the husband into the ambulance and transported him to the hospital. As officers, our job wasn't over. Now we had to figure out what had happened before we got there. We interviewed everyone we could. Family members, children, relatives. Anyone who had been inside that house. The more statements we took, the more one thing became obvious. The family wasn't just upset. They were hiding something. Or maybe a better way to say it is, they were protecting something. Eventually, the truth came out. Before we ever arrived, the husband and wife had been involved in a violent argument. The argument became physical. According to the investigation, he slapped her and humiliated her in front of members of her family. In the middle of that confrontation, she reached into the kitchen drawer, grabbed an ice pick, and stabbed him once in the neck. One puncture wound, that's all it took. The wound was so small that it wasn't immediately obvious. There was only a tiny hole in his clothing. But that ice pick had pierced his carotid artery. While firefighters were desperately trying to save his life, he was bleeding internally. Later that day, the husband died at the hospital from complications related to that injury. His wife was interviewed and arrested. But the story didn't end there. As investigators dug deeper, we learned something that completely changed how many people viewed that day. This wasn't the first time violence had entered that home. The husband was on parole because of what he had previously done to his wife. During an earlier domestic violence incident, he had beaten her so severely that she was hospitalized for days, possibly weeks. This wasn't an isolated argument. It was part of a history of abuse. As the case continued through the justice system, the charges against her were ultimately dropped. That doesn't erase the tragedy. A man lost his life. A family was forever changed. Children witnessed something they can never unsee. But it does remind us that what we observe during the first few minutes of a call is rarely the entire story. When I first walked into that house, I thought I was looking at a woman calmly frying chicken while her husband was dying. By the end of the investigation, I realized I had been looking at years of fear, trauma, violence, and pain that no one could see just by walking through the front door. Don't rush to judge people. That's one of the greatest lessons that I've ever learned. Don't rush to judge people. Investigate, listen, observe, and let the facts tell the story. Sometimes, the smallest clue, a smell, a whisper, a strange behavior, isn't the answer. It's simply the beginning of an understanding. Okay, yeah, you're extremely lucky tonight. You're going to get the opportunity to listen to 2 of the stories. Today's episode, number 2, is called Delusional. Dispatch sent me to what sounded like one of the most serious calls a patrol officer can receive.
Bravo 25?
Bravo 25, go ahead.
I need you to respond to 11345 14th Street regarding
A 14-year-old boy had called 911. He told the dispatcher his father had been beating him for days. He said his dad would be home in about 20 minutes, and when he got there, he was going to get beaten again. When you hear something like that over the radio, your mind immediately shifts into protection mode. If there's a child in danger, you get there. You don't waste time. The investigation. When I arrived, the young man was waiting for me. He was scared, or at least he appeared to be. We sat down and talked while we waited for his father to get home. As we talked, I kept asking questions like, well, what happened? He would tell me, well, when did it happen? And how often? Basically, what he was doing is he was telling me that he's in trouble with his father because he refused to wash the dishes. And it's just kind of funny the way it's playing out, because he's about to panic because the father is about to come home and he knows that the dad's going to get physical with him. But as I'm talking to him little bit by little bit, the story started to change. Eventually, the real issue surfaced. His father left him one responsibility: to clean the kitchen. Apparently, it hadn't been cleaned for a couple of days, and the dad's just sitting there watching the plate stack, so to speak. So before leaving for work, Dad, he made himself very clear. If that kitchen isn't clean by the time I get home, you're going to get in trouble, and I'm going to physically put my hands on you. Now, whether someone agrees with that type of discipline or not, that isn't the point of this story. The point is that in this young man's mind, those words became something completely different. He honestly believed calling the police would solve the problem. On your parents. He expected us to come in, take his side, tell Dad he couldn't discipline him, and somehow make the whole thing disappear. Delusional. Dad arrives. About 20 minutes later, Dad pulls into the driveway. He walked inside, saw a Sacramento police officer standing in his living room, looked at me and asked, "Officer, what's going on?" I explained to him why I was there. I told him exactly what his son had reported. I watched his face change. If there was ever a moment someone looked like they wanted to turn into the Incredible Hulk, this was it. Not because he wanted to hurt his son. He was pissed off because he couldn't believe his own child had called the police and accused him of abusing him. As I spent more time talking with Dad, another picture emerged. This wasn't an abusive father. This was a single father working hard every day to provide for his son. He paid the bills. He kept a roof over their heads. He made sure there was food in the house. He wasn't asking his son to do 10 things. He was asking him to do one: clean the kitchen. The moment. I'll never forget watching that young man while his father and I talked. Every few minutes, I'd glance over at him. He looked like he was about to pass out. Not because he was afraid of me, because he was realizing something. Calling 911 hadn't gone the way he thought it would. The police weren't there to simply take his side. We were there to find out the truth. And once the truth came out, the conversation changed. The lesson. One of the biggest misconceptions people have is believing the police exist to automatically validate whoever calls them first. That's not our job. Our job is to investigate. Sometimes the caller is the victim. Sometimes the caller is mistaken. Sometimes the caller leaves out important facts. And sometimes the caller learns a lesson they weren't expecting. That day, a 14-year-old learned that responsibility doesn't disappear because you dial 3 numbers. Police officers don't replace parents. We protect children from abuse. But we also recognize good parents who are trying to raise responsible young adults. That father wasn't asking for perfection. He was asking his son to do his part. And somewhere during that conversation, I think that young man realized something that would stay with him for a long time. Life gets a lot easier when you take responsibility before someone else has to remind you. I'm Samuel Davis Jr., and this has been another episode of Law Enforcement Encounters. Thank you for listening.